welcome back to the second part on my series for the Italo-Ethiopian Wars. In this video, I'm going to discuss the Italian army, how it was composed, its structure, its arms, and how they performed. I'm going to go through it unit by unit. So I'm going to go through the Italian troops, the Ascari, and the wide amount of irregulars. First thing to talk about is the Italian army. From 1884, when the Italians first arrived in East Africa and Eritrea, they just had line infantry, and they used a lot of irregulars to help them. But in 1887, they formed the Cacciatori d'Africa, which were like light infantry, chasseur type units. They consisted both of foot infantry, of leg infantry, and mounted rifles. But by 1896, those troops had been reduced only to one battalion. I'm not able to find out if that one battalion was mounted infantry or leg infantry, though I haven't seen any references to mounted infantry, so I'm going to assume they're leg infantry. They would have been armed in 1887 when they were initially raised with Model 1870 Vetterlis, single-shot Vetterlis. Eventually, they would receive the 1870-87 magazine-fed Vetterli. By the time of the Battle of Adwa, they didn't have Carcanos. They were still using Vetterlis. The Cacciatori d'Africa were, for their part, they were real professionals. They were old Africa hands. They'd been serving in Africa since 1887. These troops, I mean, not all of them, but the units had been in existence that long. They were used to the climate, used to the food, used to the marching, and they were professional soldiers. They would be uniformed with white uniforms, with white leggings, and white sun helmets, with a blackish green cockerel, the feathers you see, like the Bersaglieri. At some point in the 1890s, they do start to receive khaki uniforms, though I don't know. I've seen depictions, period descriptions, the paintings of the Battle of Adwa, and the men do seem to be either represented in khaki or white. And so there could have been a mix. I mean, there very likely was a mix. Officers might have blue uniforms, white uniforms, khaki uniforms, any combination thereof. But those are the Cacciatori d'Africa. They were really good troops. They were professionals, but they weren't really around in great numbers. The remainder of the Italian troops in Africa consisted of the Fanteria d'Africa, the Bersaglieri d'Africa, and the Alpini d'Africa. The Fanteria d'Africa, they came from the Italian conscripts on the units on the mainland. Some of them were volunteers, others were drawn by ballot, and they came from all different sort of units from all over Italy. And so that caused a bit of a cohesion problem because they were commanded by officers they didn't know into units with men they'd never trained with before. A lot of them, this is before Italian was really solidified as one language. So you had a lot of different dialects, some more intelligible than others, mutually intelligible. And a lot of these men, they only really arrived in 1895. Some of them arrived in 1896 and got off the boat and marched straight with the column to Adwa. So they had really no chance to train. They had no chance to acclimate to Africa. They were poorly equipped for Africa. The uniforms were, they didn't have a lot of steady supply of uniforms. So some would have went in with white, some with khaki. They had boots of varying qualities, not always very good. They often had incomplete sets of personal equipment. Many were armed with old Remington rolling block rifles that had once belonged to the Papal States, and those weapons are really quite old. The men hadn't trained with them before. A lot of those men had either trained on Vetterlis, or some had even trained on Carcanos before they turned those weapons in and got on a boat to head to Africa. And so that would actually cause a lot of training issues. They had cohesion problems, and they just weren't acclimatized to Africa. In spite of that, they actually fought with very determined defense at Adwa in 1896. There were 5 battalions of Bersaglieri d'Africa, and they arrived in 1895, and 1 battalion of Alpini d'Africa, who also arrived in 1895. They would have been armed most likely with Vetterli 1870-87 rifles with the repeating rifle with the 4-round box magazine. There's some speculation that the Alpini may have actually had Carcanos, though there was no real concrete evidence on that, and I would doubt it. The Italian government didn't really have a large supply of ammunition built up, at least that's according to the Italian government at the time, and pretty much that kind of rounds out the Italian infantry. I wasn't really able to find much information on the artillery, the character of the units, but they certainly had it. They had 56 75B mountain guns at Adwa. They didn't have as much regular Italian cavalry. They had one regiment, though I'm not really quite sure if it's native or regular. It's colonial, so it could be either. It didn't say native, it didn't say Ascari, and they were armed with Vetterlis. I do not believe they were Lancers or anything special. I didn't read anything like that. Moving on past the Italian forces, I'd like to talk about the Ascari now. The first units of Ascari were formed in 1888 in Eritrea, and by the time of the Battle of Adwa, they had Ascari from Eritrea, Somalia, and they had many Sudanese Ascari. They were quite excellent troops. They were well drilled. They were highly disciplined. They fought very fiercely, partially because the Ethiopians would really show them no quarter. They'd receive very brutal treatment if they surrendered, and so they fought very well. And they were some of the best troops in Africa. Also, much like the Kakitori de Africa, they were acclimatized. I mean, they were from East Africa, and so they were used to the food and the diseases and the climate, and they weathered it quite well, a lot better than really the bulk of the Italian forces that were pushed in 1895. These troops, along with the Cacciatori de Africa, they're really going to be the hardened core of the army. And they were well equipped. They weren't really worse equipped than the Italian troops. Some had Model 1870 single shot Vetterlis, but many had 1870 87 Vetterlis. They had cavalry, which included lancers. They had their own artillery. There are pictures of these men manning Gardner machine guns. And so they were very, very, very well equipped troops. The uniforms, I believe, at this time were all white. Khaki uniforms would come into use, though I'm not sure if they come into use before 1897. The fezzes are red, that you'll sometimes see fezzes adorned and decorated in different ways, but I do believe the base fez was red. I'll also include under the Ascari the indigenous military police units that served a similar role to Carabini. They were called Zapti. I don't really know if they fought in the campaigns, but they were certainly used in the colonies to keep order. And so I just figured I would mention them. They're not really the Ascari, but they are uniformed African troops under Italian command, and they are regular troops. In addition to the conventional regular forces, the Italians also employed a very large number of irregular troops. This man here is Eritrean, and they were very, very similar in their fighting style and dress to the Ethiopians. They acted as both infantry, cavalry. Some were armed with rifles, some with just spears and swords. And so you can use them in a game as irregular cavalry, irregular infantry, tribal cavalry, tribal infantry. And they're going to fight pretty much the same as all the irregulars I'm going to mention. And so let's get into it. Here's another picture showing the Eritreans with their very Ethiopian style shields. I mean, a lot of times you don't know if they're Eritreans or Ethiopians from the photos. The Italians employ a large number of Somalis in their army. The Somalis, they're Muslims mostly. They fight they fight with rifles, spears, bows, both on foot and on horse. They're very useful. They're excellent scouts. They're good for small war because their tribal warfare is very much, they raid a lot, and so it's very useful for the Italians. Just to employ them on the borders and in the proxy wars that they want to fight. From 1884, the earliest days of Italian colonization in East Africa, they employ Bashi bazouks, and they describe these men as Turks. Now, they may be ethnic Turks, they may be another ethnicity from the Ottoman Empire, but these men originated in the Ottoman Empire, in Egypt, going down the Nile, and Bashi bazouks will actually be used in 1936 as irregulars. The Italians will employ a very large number of irregulars in their armies, both in small war tasks like raiding and scouting, but also in main battles. I mean, there are irregulars that are present at Adwa. There's often an Italian attached officer with the units. Their discipline and quality can vary quite a bit, often really dependent on the officer, sort of the force of will and the charisma of the Italian officer with them. And you see that actually in 1936 and in 1941. Respectively. The nature of these armies don't change a lot. The technology does, but the nature of the armies remain the same from 1896 to 1936 to 1941. And so this guide can almost kind of guide you there if you want to include more modern weapons for the later wars. Now, the Italian soldiers will actually be engaged from 1885 with the Ethiopians in border fights and proxy wars. They'll fight them in a battle at Dogali in 1887, which they lose. They'll continue to fight the Ethiopians at Kassala in 1894, Coatit 1895, Sonate 1895, the siege of Makale in December 1895. Toseli's columns ambushed 3,000 men. Ascari ambushed in 1895, December 1895, and they fight them at Adwa in 1896. The Italians usually kind of get the worst of the fighting with the Ethiopians. They also fought the Mahdi, the Mahdists. They fought them in 1890 and again in 1893 in two battles, the first and second battle of Agordat, in which they were victorious. They really ran roughshod over those guys. And so did the Ethiopians. They didn't really have a difficult time with the Mahdi. Overall, the Italian army was variable in quality. The Cacciatori d'Africa and the Ascari were really excellent troops. Uh, the Fanteria d'Africa, and any of the troops that had newly arrived in 1895 were not as good. The Bersaglieri and Alpini are good troops, but you're going to have to take a little bit off of that because they weren't used to that climate, and so they're good troops, but they probably weren't up to their full potential. The weapons are okay for the time period. They're really as good as what the Ethiopians have. They have Vetterli Model 1870 single shots, Model 1870 87 repeaters. Um, they also have some Remington rolling blocks, and it's not a bad gun, but the rolling blocks they had were a little bit older, and they were maybe not the best maintained, and the troops hadn't really used them and trained on them, and so they would lose some effectiveness there. They had 75B mountain guns, they had Gardner machine guns, and so they were pretty well set in that regard. And even those troops that come under-equipped and underprepared in 1895, they really fight better than they ought to. And so, where's the Italian army's failure? And it's overconfidence. Whereas the Ethiopians have an army with a lot of limitations, and they're aware of those limitations and they work around them. The Italian army has a lot of limitations, and they're just really confident. They don't understand their shortcomings. They don't adjust for those shortcomings. I mean, they send men straight off the boats. In Eritrea and march them right in with the columns into Ethiopia. They have no chance to acclimatize. And so that's a big problem. They have very poor military intelligence. They estimate Menelik's army at 30,000 men. Menelik had roughly 110,000 men at Adwa. 80,000 of those men had rifles. And so it's a real intelligence failure, overconfidence, very poor preparation. When I think about it, I think perhaps their easy victories over the Mahdists may have given them false confidence, as the Mahdists had given the British and the Egyptians a lot of trouble. They may have been fighting more of main armies that the Mahdi had. They may not have been fighting. That's who the British were facing. Probably the better commanders. The Italians may have been fighting some lesser units. I really don't know. And their victories, they have two fights with the Mahdists, two real fights, and their victories come seemingly pretty easy. And so that would be my guess. They're not fighting the top tier commanders out of the Sudan. But the Ethiopians, they run all over them. And so this is really it for my brief overview of the Italian army from 1884 to 1897. It's an army that's not really a bad army, but the way that it was employed made it less than the sum of its parts. If you were to wargame it, you could really make good effect to the units, especially the Cacciatori d'Africa and the Ascari, and really I think would be interesting the irregulars. They add a lot of flavor to it. But let me know what you think. I may do an army list video after this. It's kind of difficult because these Italian, even the troops that show up, they do fight better than they ought to. They fight better than the stuff would suggest, the facts about them suggest. So I'm not really sure. If you like this video, please let me know. Leave me a comment. If you're liking my new style of videos with the title cards and things like that, I would appreciate it. I've changed up my recording. Kind of have some foam, and I'm not really sure how recording works, but I put some foam around this to absorb sound, stray sound. So if that's working, if I sound better, I probably don't. And if you want to see anything else next as far as colonial armies, let me know. I do have a lot of books that I haven't read, and so I can probably crack into those and make a video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.